Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really wrestling with a big question, one that feels incredibly relevant right now. What makes a story true, especially when we're talking about something as intense, as profound as war? How do you even begin to separate, the hard facts from memory, experience, and just powerful storytelling?
It's such a crucial question, isn't it? Because our whole understanding of recent history, it really hinges on the stories we consume. And when those stories come directly from people who lived it, well, those lines between fact and, let's say, emotional truth, they can blur in really potent ways.
Exactly. So that's our focus for this deep dive. American veteran narratives from the global war on terrorism, the GWOT. Our mission really is to unpack how these stories work, especially the fictional ones. How do they manage to convey this unique kind of truth? How does the public receive them? And, what's the deeper impact on how we all understand conflict?
Yeah, and we're drawing on quite a mix of sources today. We've got academic work looking at literary authenticity, analysis of how veterans are portrayed in film, and even a look at how veterans themselves are using music to share what they went through. It's going to be quite a journey into how these stories get told and, maybe more importantly, how they're heard.
So if we're chasing this idea of the truth of war, where do we start? You mentioned a term, authofiction. That sounds like our first key. What is that exactly? Is it just a novel? A memoir?
Right, authofiction. It's interesting because it deliberately mixes fictional storytelling with what academics sometimes call the epistemic primacy of testimony.
Okay, big words. What does that mean in practice?
It just means we naturally give more weight, more belief to a story told by someone who is actually there. Their experience, their identity as a veteran acts like a stamp of authenticity on the narrative. So even if parts are made up, the story feels true because of who's telling it. It's not about tricking the reader necessarily, but about using that personal connection to convey a deeper, maybe an emotional truth that just listing facts might miss.
That makes sense. It taps into that personal authority. I know the philosopher Paul Ricoeur talked about how narrative shapes our understanding. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Ricoeur's idea of threefold mimesis, it sounds complex, but think of it like this. First, you, the listener, you come to a story with your own ideas, your own understanding of the world, right? Your pre-existing map. That's
Mm.
prefiguration.
Okay,
Then the story itself takes those pieces and arranges them, shapes them in a new way. That's the configuration part. The narrative works its magic.
right.
And finally, after experiencing the story, your own map of reality, your understanding, it's subtly changed, maybe even profoundly reshaped. That's refiguration. It's why a really good war novel can feel truer than a dry history lesson. It actually alters how you see things.
That's a fantastic explanation. It's like the story rewires our perception. And this idea, this blend of experience and fiction, it's not totally new in war writing, is it? When you look back at earlier conflicts.
No, not at all. In fact, a lot of the really landmark war literature often appears post-bellum, meaning years after the fighting stopped. Think Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, written decades after the Civil War.
Right.
Or for Vietnam, you have Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War, Michael Hare's Dispatches, both from '77, and Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried in 1990. These writers had time, distance, perspective.
But the GWT literature was different, wasn't it? A lot of it came out much faster, almost while the events were still unfolding.
That's a key difference. Much of the earliest GWOT writing took the form of memoirs or autobiographies. Very direct accounts. Chris Kyle's American Sniper, Gary Bernstein's Jawbreaker, Colby Buzzell's My War Blog Turned Book, Kayla Williams' Love My Rifle More Than You.
Yeah, immediate raw stuff. And journalists embedded too, like Dexter Filkins with The Forever War.
Exactly. These first-hand accounts, whether memoir or journalism, came out quickly, and this is where authofiction comes in later, building on that sense of immediacy but using fictional tools. These authofictions, even though they say novel on the cover, they often work hard to position themselves as the most authentic way to understand the experience. They talk about the real world indirectly, but in a way that tries to shut down doubts about their, quote, authentic nature. It's a rhetorical strategy.
You can really see that blurring in novels where the author's own background is front and center, like David Abrams' Fobbit.
Right, Fobbit from 2012. It's a satirical look at life on a forward operating base, the whole Fobbit versus line soldier divide. And the main character, Chance Gooding, he's a public affairs officer.
Just like Abrams was.
Exactly. That connection is right there. It invites you, the reader, to see the story as grounded in the author's real lived experience, lending it that authentic weight.
And it wasn't just single perspectives either. right? Some GWOT fiction started bringing in multiple viewpoints, even non-American ones.
Yeah, that's a really significant trend. Moving beyond just the American soldier's story. Phil Clay's Missionaries does this, weaving together American and Colombian characters. Roy Scranton's War Porn gives you an Iraqi mathematician's perspective alongside the American soldier.
Wow.
And Brian Van Rietz's Spoils even includes the voice of an Afghan emir. It's a conscious effort to broaden the lens, to show the conflict isn't just one thing, experienced one way.
Which ties back to something veteran writers often say they're trying to do, right? Answer that question civilians always ask. So what was it really like over there?
Precisely. Kevin Powers, Phil Clay, many others have talked about using fiction as a bridge to cross that gap between military experience and civilian understanding. The fiction allows them to explore the emotional core, the complexity, in ways maybe a straight factual account can't.
And you can't talk about blurring fact and fiction in war writing without mentioning Tim O'Brien.
Absolutely not. The things they carried is just seminal here. Having a narrator named Tim O'Brien who constantly questions how you tell a true war story, he really paved the way for so much of this authofictional approach in GWOT literature.
So it's about the how of telling as much as the what. Caleb Cage had an interesting take on this, suggesting fiction might actually be more honest in some ways.
Yeah, Cage argued that fiction can offer this largely unmediated variety of stories, stories that feel honest, forthright, nuanced, and sincere. He kind of contrasts this with nonfiction, which he suggests can sometimes be carefully manufactured. The idea is that fiction, paradoxically, might get closer to an emotional or psychological truth because it's not bound by the need to be factually verifiable in every detail.
But how do we, as readers, process that? How do we decide what feels true in a novel? Is it just gut feeling?
Well, Richard Walsh's rhetorical theory offers some insight here. It suggests we don't approach reading like fact checkers, not initially anyway. Our first question is usually, is this relevant? Does this resonate with me? Does it feel important?
Okay, relevance first.
Right. And only after we feel that connection, that relevance, do we really start thinking hard about truthfulness. And here's the interesting part. External cues, knowing the author is a veteran, reading interviews, the books marketing these things heavily influence whether we take parts of the story as factual, sometimes even more than the text itself.
Which brings us perfectly to Nico Walker's Cherry. That book caused quite a stir.
It really did. Cherry is a prime example of this authofictional tension. It's subtitled A Novel. It has this very blunt author's note saying, basically, this is fiction, none of this happened, these people aren't real.
Right, very clear disclaimer.
But then, in interviews, Walker himself really emphasized the book's accuracy, connecting the protagonist's experiences, including things like drug addiction and bank robberies, directly to his own life after serving in Iraq.
So a direct contradiction between the book's label and the author's public statements.
Exactly. And that contradiction fueled a lot of debate about truth, fiction, responsibility, especially concerning the portrayal of real crimes. It shows just how much those things outside the story itself, what academics call paratextual elements, shape how you, the reader, engage with it and what kind of truth you ultimately find there.
The Cherry example really underscores how complex this gets, especially when we pivot to the psychological impact of war,
Yeah.
that internal landscape. You know, Nietzsche's famous line, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger.
Yeah, that really has not stood the test of time, as one source put it, particularly when you look at PTSD research and the realities of psychological trauma.
How has our understanding, or at least our portrayal of that trauma, evolved over time? Before Vietnam, for instance.
Historically, it's a stark difference. Pre-Vietnam, the general perception, reflected in films and culture, was that veterans largely adjusted okay psychologically. The focus was overwhelmingly on physical injuries. Movies back then, things like Shell Shock or Patton, often mirrored a military culture that was pretty intolerant of shell shock, as they called it then. It was often depicted as something faked or just something you grit your teeth and get over.
But Vietnam changed everything.
Massively. It was such an unpopular war, fostering deep public skepticism. The anti-war movement also used the psychological toll on soldiers as a powerful argument against the conflict. And then, critically, PTSD gets officially recognized in the DSM in 1982. That was huge. It legitimized the suffering, opened doors for treatment, research, VA compensation. It changed the entire conversation.
And presumably changed how veterans were portrayed in movies after that.
Absolutely. By the mid-70s, you start seeing much more complex portrayals. Veterans weren't just heroes or victims, they were often both, sometimes unpredictable, hyper-violent, like Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver.
A classic disturbing example.
Oh, right. But also, in films like The Deer Hunter, PTSD provides kind of rationale for a character like Nick's numbness, his detachment. It actually allowed audiences to feel more empathy, to understand the internal damage.
Then came the 80s and Rambo.
Yeah, the Rambo figure initially represented that heroic, capable, but deeply scarred veteran. But by the late 80s, that archetype started feeling a bit cliche, so films shifted again, moving towards what some call a more humane guise, really trying to psychologize the war experience, focusing on therapeutic journeys or sometimes breakdowns like in Jacob's Ladder, much more internal focus.
And how about post 9/11 films? How do they depict veterans dealing with trauma?
We see another interesting shift there. Often these veterans aren't portrayed as total outcasts, but as members of communities trying to reintegrate. But the conflict, the anger, it's frequently turned inward or towards family and friends rather than directed at the government or the war itself. They're often shown as innocent, bewildered, and desperate, struggling with their experiences. Think of films like In the Valley of Elah or Redacted, or Brothers from 2009. That's a powerful example of the violent outbursts, the strain on family, the long, hard path to recovery.
This focus on trauma, though, it brings us to another critical idea, Roy Scranton's concept of the trauma hero myth. What's that about?
Scranton's critique is really important. He argues that this trauma hero idea, the notion that the truth of war is this ineffable thing beyond words known only by those who've been there, actually reduces veterans to just their psychological wounds.
How so? What's the danger there?
The danger is that it simplifies everything. It focuses solely on individual pain and overlooks the broader political, social, and historical context of war. It can almost excuse society from deeper engagement. Scranton says this myth shapes our politics, our news, even our history writing. It becomes the dominant, sometimes only, lens.
That's a really provocative point. It limits our understanding. And this isn't just about PTSD, is it? There's talk about moral injury, too.
Right. Joshua Pederson's work on moral injury tries to look beyond just trauma. Moral injury is about the damage done when someone's actions, or actions they witnessed, violate their own deeply held moral beliefs. It's a different kind of wound. A crucial distinction, though, as you said, there's a risk of just swapping one defining affliction for another.
And tied into this idea of who gets to speak about war, there's something called combat Gnosticism.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell coined that term. It's that sort of ugly undercurrent, as one writer put it, that insists only those who have experienced combat have the right to write or speak about war authentically. Matt Gallagher, himself a veteran and writer, has pushed back hard against this, calling it limiting and counterproductive.
It all seems connected to how the public interacts, or maybe tries to interact, with veterans. Which leads us to the whole thank you for your service thing, TYFYS. You see so much discussion about this online, like on Reddit. What are the different takes on it?
It's incredibly mixed. On one hand, many veterans genuinely appreciate it. They see it as a positive and necessary shift away from the hostility many Vietnam veterans face the baby killer insults. It's seen as a basic sign of respect, an acknowledgement that society supports the troops, even if they disagree with the war.
Okay, so a positive signal for some.
Definitely. But on the other side, you have veterans who find it hollow, like lip service, from a public that's largely disconnected from the realities of these long wars fought by a small volunteer force. They feel it lets civilians off the hook too easily. Some even link it to vet bro culture, seeing it as performative patriotism rather than genuine understanding or meaningful support, like, help with jobs or healthcare. There's clearly no single way that phrase lands. It really highlights that military-civilian gap.
That gap seems central. If war is often framed as this experience that's almost impossible to describe the idea of ad nauseam, it's just too baffling for words.
Right, that very idea that war cannot be described paradoxically makes fiction more powerful, doesn't it? Because fiction can explore the subjective, the emotional, the chaotic in ways that objective historical accounts might struggle with. It gives voice to the supposedly unspeakable.
And this feels especially relevant now, given how deep that military-civilian divide has become in the U.S.
Absolutely. Since we ended the draft after Vietnam and moved to an all-volunteer force, the simple fact is that most Americans don't have a direct personal connection to the military or these recent wars. The GWOT hasn't had the same kind of broad domestic impact, no draft, relatively lower casualty numbers compared to Vietnam, less widespread protest. So for many civilians, the wars feel distant, abstract. That creates a huge experiential gulf.
And Roy Scranton warns about the danger of relying on a single story to bridge that gulf. He even says narrative is the enemy. That sounds extreme. What does he mean?
It is provocative. What Scranton means is that a single, neat, totalizing narrative, whether it's the hero story or the trauma story, inevitably simplifies and distorts reality. It reinforces biases and prevents deeper understanding. He argues we need to abandon these limited viewpoints, give up defending our truth, and instead embrace complexity and multiple perspectives.
Which brings us back to that trend in GWOT authofiction, using multiple perspectives. That seems like a direct response to this problem.
It really does. Many of these books consciously use different viewpoints to show the restricted nature of any single perspective. You mentioned Fobbit. Clay's redeployment collection does this brilliantly. Scranton's war porn, Van Riet's spoils, and crucially, including those non-American voices, breaks out of a purely partisan, U.S.-centric view. It forces a more complex, more global understanding of the conflict's impact.
It's fascinating how this plays out, even in unexpected genres. You mentioned romance novels.
Yeah, it's surprising, right? But military heroes are quite popular in romance. Now, these stories often reinforce certain archetypes, like the protector alpha male, and they tend to focus heavily on the home front, sometimes glossing over the complexities of the actual conflict or the other. That can reinforce a kind of Western viewpoint. But the genre itself, because it's about relationships and emotional healing, often necessitates a surprisingly nuanced look at PTSD. It frequently shows that love isn't a magic cure, but it is often the catalyst that helps the veteran protagonist start the hard work of self-healing. Characters like Nate in a book by Jesse Bliss or Reza in one by Joanna Scott, they illustrate this difficult journey quite well.
So what does this mean for the veteran authors who achieve success? People like Phil Clay, Roy Scranton, Matt Gallagher. They gain a certain kind of authority, don't they?
They absolutely do. These writers, often though not exclusively white men, tend to combine their veteran status, that crucial marker of authenticity, with other credentials, like MFAs, journalistic backgrounds, academic posts. This combination positions them as expert truth-tellers for a civilian audience hungry for understanding about America's wars. They gain a unique platform and significant cultural influence.
Beyond writing books, are there other creative ways veterans are processing and sharing these experiences?
Definitely. Art and music are hugely important. There's an amazing nonprofit called Creative Sets, for example. They pair veterans with songwriters and artists to help them work through service-related trauma by creating original music and art. They've released dozens of songs written by veterans, streamed millions of times. The testimonials from veterans involved are incredibly moving, talking about finding connection, community, a path to healing through creativity. It really speaks to the power of art to articulate what's difficult to say.
That's incredible. It leads to a final, maybe more philosophical point about these war narratives. Phil Clay wrote that nothing's an anti-war film. What's the implication there for war literature?
I think Clay's point is that depicting war, even critically, often contains elements that complicate a simple anti-war message. Maybe moments of courage, camaraderie, adrenaline. He suggests that much war literature isn't aiming for straightforward condemnation, but rather for a kind of nuanced ambivalence. It's about capturing the profound complexity, the contradictory mix of human experiences within conflict, rather than delivering a simple verdict on war itself, letting the messy truth of the experience speak.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into GWE veteran narratives, especially looking through that lens of authofiction, really gives us a powerful way to understand these recent conflicts. These stories are doing complex work, blending personal testimony, history, and the tools of fiction to get at difficult truths and try to bridge that huge military-civilian divide.
They really do. They force you, the listener, to think hard about what truth means, how memory works, how powerful storytelling can be. That author's lived experience lends a unique weight and authenticity even to fictional stories, and that absolutely shapes how we understand the reality of war.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. As these narratives keep coming, keep evolving, how does this blending of fictional truth and personal testimony change things? Does it reshape not just how you understand war, but maybe your basic expectations of what counts as truth in all the stories you encounter every day? And what responsibility does that put on you when you engage with these incredibly personal, historically vital accounts to really listen for the nuanced truths they're trying to tell?